We're in our Psalms to Live By series, in which we are looking at some of the great formative Psalms in the book of Psalms. And we're kind of doing this as like a festival of Psalms for the summer. And this week is Psalm 23. Now, Psalm 23 has got to be one of the most known and best loved Psalms of all. I mean, it is instantly recognizable. Everybody has heard of Psalm 23. Even if a person doesn't go to church or pay any attention to these sorts of things, there is a good chance they have heard of Psalm 23, right? It's on greeting cards, it's on calendars. Some of you might have memorized this one. It's a really good one to memorize. I think I have read from Psalm 23 for practically every funeral I've done. And the reason is that because Psalm 23 is so perfect for funerals, for those moments when we're in a time of mourning, a moment when we are seeking reassurance that God is with us and will not abandon our loved one, then Psalm 23 is so perfect. And so lots of people have heard it, right? I mean, God in Psalm 23 is envisioned as the good shepherd who guides us to green grass and cool, clear streams. God provides the nourishment and the refreshment for our souls, and God guides us on the right path. God protects us from dangers within and without. He spreads a table before us in the presence of our enemies and promises to keep us safe in his house for all eternity. That's Psalm 23. You know, every time I hear those words, I think they are just perfect for the hope that we have as God's people in times of hardship and loss. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. There's only one problem. Sometimes we love Psalm 23 so much for funerals that we forget how much meaning it has for the rest of life. I mean, as theologian Dallas Willard put it, the Lord is my shepherd is written on many more tombstones than lives. And I think all too often we're more likely to trust God, the good shepherd, for life after death than for life before death, right? But Psalm 23 is for all of life. It's for the beginning to the end to eternity. And God is calling us to trust in him for this life and for the next. Now, years ago, I connected to this gentleman. He was from the community. He was clearly in his last days. He was dying. I don't exactly even know how I got to meet him, but somehow the family got me connected to him. He wasn't part of our church, and I walked with him a little bit in the last days of his life. And then after he died, the family gave me this book called The Dash. I don't know if you've ever seen this book, The Dash. And The Dash is kind of this long prose poem, and it plays on the idea of the dates that are written on our tombstone, right? There are all kinds of things that people put on tombstones. They might say, the name, the dates, might say like loving father or loving mother or whatever. It might have the names of all the kids on the tombstone. I've seen tombstones engraved with things that were important to the person in this life. So there might be like a fish, right? They like to go fishing. Or there might be a car or some wheat or a tractor. I was just reading or just hearing recently, think about what's important to people. The inventor of Pringles, those little snack chips that come in a tube, right? Pringles. Heard the inventor of Pringles, he loved his invention so much that he told his kids that when he died, he wanted to be cremated and guess what? Buried in a Pringles container. So his kids must have gone out and ate the Pringles and put dad in there. But anyway, people do all kinds of stuff, right? That kind of moment of burial is like when you might learn a little bit of something about what's important to them. And you see all kinds of stuff on that tombstone. But I think for sure on a tombstone, you're going to see the name, you're going to see the date where the person was born, and you're going to see the date when they died, right? And I created that online, and it was surprisingly kind of impactful for me to think about what date to put on there, right? But we see that on the tombstone. There it is. And there's that little dash in the middle. And what that prose poem, The Dash, does is play on the idea that life is not about that beginning date or that ending date. It's about that space in between, right? It's about the dash. What matters most is what happens between when we're born and between when we die. Our lives aren't measured so much by the day we come into the world and the day that we exit, but what's in between, right? So what are our loves? What's our work? What are our commitments? What matters to us? That's what counts. Life is in the dash. And I think that kind of works for Psalm 23 as well, right? Psalm 23 is not just for the beginning, and it's not just for the end as much as we might love it for funerals, but Psalm 23 is not just for engraving on tombstones, it's for etching on the stuff of our lives. Now, Psalm 23 is a psalm of trust. And this psalm was written by David, like a lot of the psalms. And I think, think about David's life, right? David was someone who's touched by God at so many points in his lives. I mean, God chose David when he was just a shepherd boy, and God gave him the strength and the agility to defeat the giant warrior Goliath. Remember that story? And then God protected him from Saul and guided David to become the next king of Israel. And God saved him later on from rebellion. And God led David to lay the groundwork for building the temple. But it wasn't just that God was with David in those high points, those moments of triumph. If you look at David's life, you also see that God was there for him in the hard moments and the low moments, right? Like when David committed adultery. And so when David talks about God being his shepherd, like he does in Psalm 23, about God walking with him through the darkest valley or the valley of the shadow of death, about God preparing a table before him in the presence of his enemies, David knows of which he speaks. It's not something that he's coming up with from some comfortable couch up in the palace. David has lived it, right? The Lord really is his shepherd. This is a lived reality that he's writing about. The Lord really has fulfilled David's wants, really has laid a table before him in the presence of his enemies, really has walked with him through those very dark and scary places. Now, the image that drives this whole psalm, Psalm 23, the image is of God as the good shepherd, right? And so the shepherd does what shepherds do. It guides the flock to green grass. Shepherd guides to the still waters. The shepherd is with the flock, with us in that darkest valley, protecting us from evil with rod and staff. And every single one of those images is an image of trust. It's not kind of like a mechanical thing. It's not like buying an insurance policy. It's about trusting in this living, breathing person, the good shepherd. Now, I don't know if you have much experience with sheep. Sometimes we kind of look down on sheep as like these dumb animals, right? Like sheep are kind of, when you think of sheep, you think of like followers, right? They don't know what they're doing. They just follow. But, sheep have their own kind of intelligence. They won't just follow anybody. If you try to go in and round up sheep and they don't know you, they're going to spook and run. And I know this because we had sheep when we were growing up as kids, and we were terrible shepherds, right? My brothers and I would show sheep in 4-H, and you're supposed to like work with your sheep all year round and kind of get them used to you and tame them down. And we didn't do any of that, right? We would always, there would always be some little girl that would come into the 4-H ring, and she'd have this little lamb that she had been working with, and she would lead that thing all around on a halter, and it would obey her every little gentle tug, and she'd be wearing like a pink cowboy hat and pink boots. But we were the kids that wrestled our sheep down about 3 days before the fair, and then wrestled them, up to the place where we'd give them a bath, and then wrestled them into the back of the truck, and then wrestled them into the pen at the 4-H grounds. And so by that time, not only had we not tamed them down, but they were like more wild, right? They're like, what's next? And so then we'd get these sheep out into the ring, and they would usually freak out, and we'd end up getting drug around or losing control and having to try to catch our sheep. That was us. We were really terrible shepherds. But here's David. He's talking about God as the good shepherd. He's saying that God has our best interest at heart, that God loves us, and so it's totally opposite, right? Is that God as the shepherd who cares for us and leads us to what we need. And so the question that comes up when we read this psalm is, do we believe in this image of God as the good shepherd who is seriously holding our best interests at heart, who is seriously seeking the very best for his people? Do we believe that for our lives? I mean, maybe we believe that for when we die, that God is the good shepherd who will guide us to his eternal home, but do we believe that for our lives? Do we just put Psalm 23 on our tombstones, or do we believe that God is there and trustworthy for the dash? Now, I think there's at least two ways that we can think about God calling us to trust him as the good shepherd in this psalm. Now, the first one is to trust God in need. And that is really the opening of this psalm. It says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," or "I shall not be in want." The word here in Hebrew is pretty straightforward. To want, it's like to be hungry, or to decrease, or to have a need. And so, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall want for nothing. That means that God provides for the needs of those whom he shepherds. And look, this is probably one of those places where we can get really cynical really fast. I don't know if this is just because of who we are as modern people or what. But I mean, I think you look around, you look out at the world, and it's not hard to see that there is a lot of need out there. And we know that good things don't come for free. And we know that there's so much that can intervene in life, and there can be a lot of suffering. We know you got to work for the stuff of life. So what does this mean to say that God provides? And what I like to keep in mind, and what I think we've got to remember, is that David is the one doing the writing. And you got to remember that David grew up as an actual shepherd boy. That is where the prophet Samuel went to find him when it was the moment to anoint him as king. David was a farm kid, right? He knew about planting and harvesting. He knew that he had to tend well his family's flocks, that their sheep and their cattle and whatever other animals they had would have as many babies as possible, and thus his family's wealth would increase. David himself, he talks about in the scriptures how when he was a kid, he'd be out there with his sling and his staff, and a bear or a lion or whatever, the natural predators in that area, would come after his sheep, and he would drive them off. So I mean, he was a brave kid, but he knew what his job was, and he did it well. He was a shepherd boy. So David's not some dreamer who thinks that if you just kind of pray, all of your needs will go away. David knows that life is complicated. David knows there's some hardship. And yet, there's a truth here. God provides. And I know in one way that is too simplistic, right? And we don't want to give glib answers to complicated problems of poverty and world hunger. I mean, you look at what's going on in the Tigray region of Ethiopia right now. You don't just want to be like, oh, God provides, you're good. I mean, it sort of makes me think of what James says, right? Like, what good is faith if you see someone in need and you don't help them out, right? And just say, go and be well. I mean, we know that faith and action go together. We know life is complicated, and yet God provides, right? It's this material reality, but it is more than that. God is the good shepherd who shows up with just what we need, and often just at the right time. Sometimes God will bring someone into our life that we desperately need. God gives that little tap on the shoulder to us sometimes and say, hey, I don't think you want to go down that path. You ever experienced that? God helps us to understand something about a situation that we're in or about ourselves. God sometimes helps us to open a door that seems impossibly jammed shut. God provides in a way that is not always easy to get, and that in fact is mysterious to us. And that goes for our material needs too. I mean, it's one of those things that you really got to experience to be able to grasp. It's one of those moments where you kind of walk out onto a limb, into a place of vulnerability, and discover that impossibly God is there for you. Now, I will readily admit that when we start talking about God providing, that some of this is not easy for me personally. I have pretty low tolerance for vulnerability in my own life. I mean, I'm kind of a planner. I like to save. I like to know what we're going to eat. I like to have health insurance figured out. We're the kind of people that, like, we buy the big thing of toilet paper, right? So you don't run out. You put that down in your basement, that sort of thing. I like to plan ahead, right? But every once in a while, You'll have these moments, and I guess we kind of all had that at some point last year, but every once in a while you'll have one of these moments where you realize just how vulnerable you truly are. Like the power goes out, or you get sick, or something happens in your life that reminds you that you are not in control. I remember back when we used to live in Peru, in the part of the city of Cusco where we were living, they would have these periodic water cutoffs, and so you'd like open the tap and nothing comes out, right? There's no advanced warning for this. You're just getting ready to boil some noodles or something like that, and there is no water. God have mercy on you if you're in the shower and all lathered up, and then there's no water. But these moments where you just turn on the water and there's nothing, and after a couple hours, it would usually turn back on. But look, that was not something that I was accustomed to, right? Like that was a vulnerability that was forced upon us, and it was a small thing in the scheme of life, but it just wasn't something I was used to. It just makes you realize like how dependent you are on so many other factors that are out there. But usually when we're trying to keep ourselves from being vulnerable, the reality is that what we're doing, or at least what I'm doing, is trying to maintain my comfort and security through control. And that's not exactly what you see in the Bible. Right? The people of Israel were an agrarian people. When the rains were right, they had a harvest, but they also had to worry about locusts and raiders. There were just so many events in their life that were not under control. And that was really even after they came into the promised land and settled it. Before that time, you remember this story, the people of Israel wandered in the desert, and so they depended on God to give them their food, which came as this mysterious substance that they called manna that would kind of collect on the ground. The later Psalms talk about it as the bread of angels, right? And you could only pick up enough manna for one day. And they weren't canning it. They weren't storing it in a basement. They just would go out every day and get the manna that they needed. And those are the people that God was writing to. Right? People who had the memory of living in the desert and relying on God for their daily food. And this kind of impacted how the people of Israel thought about everything. I mean, elsewhere in the Psalms, you see the psalmist saying, I don't put my trust in kings. I don't put my trust in the power of horses and in chariots. I put my trust in God, right? They were people who knew what David meant when he said, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. That rung true for them. And sometimes I wonder if we are so comfortable and so secure that we're not willing to put ourselves out there and really depend on God. And what I keep wondering is if we need to get in the practice of letting ourselves be vulnerable before God. I personally feel like this is a place that I need to grow in and kind of stretch myself in, and I know it's a stretch because I honestly have a hard time even imagining what it would look like, right? It's kind of Psalm 23 as an invitation to go beyond ourselves for God. And I think just kind of put that out there, right? We are following a real being, the God of the universe who made us and knows us and loves us. Where's God calling you to take that step of faith? It's kind of like Peter, come out onto the water, right? Walk on that water. Where is God saying, hey, step out of the boat? Where is God saying, come with me? I've got this rod and this staff. Let's go walking. And yes, there may be valleys. Where is God calling you just to take that step of faith? And I think each of us will experience that in different ways, right? That step into some vulnerability, which is a step into trust in him. At the same time, I think I kind of have this sense, even though I can't fully imagine what this would look like for me, and maybe you can't imagine it for yourself either, I have this sense for what God, in trusting in God in times of need. I have a little bit of a sense for what that would mean for me, and I kind of know what that would mean because I kind of know what he might be calling me to. And this is the thing, it's not this impersonal rule. It's the good shepherd who leads each of us personally, who calls each of us to step out personally, right? Where is that for you? And the good shepherd also calls us to live beyond our fears. This is really verse 4. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Have you ever walked through the valley of the shadow of death? Do you know what David is talking about when he uses that phrase, the valley of the shadow of death? If you haven't walked through that place, at some point in your life, you will more than likely find yourself there. You know, David had experienced the valley of the shadow of death in spades. I mean, when David was just a kid, he fought Goliath the giant with nothing but a sling. When he was a young guy serving in the court of King Saul, Saul would get so enraged for really no reason at all that David wouldn't know what was going to happen. One time, Saul picked up a spear while David's sitting there playing his harp, and Saul throws that spear at him, and David, by the grace of God, is able to kind of duck out of the way and get out of the palace. Later, David would find himself out in the desert as this leader of a movement that would go on to replace Saul as king. I mean, Saul kept trying to hunt him down, but could never find him and kill him. David later on faced real enemies in battle. He lived dangerously. He had experienced profound losses. He had made terrible mistakes. And there were many times that David had wandered down into that valley of the shadow of death. And there were many times while David was down there walking in the dark when he had experienced the presence of God with him. And David says, God's rod and staff comfort him. Because it's the rod and the staff that protect him. It's the shepherd walking with him and keeping danger away from him. That was David's experience. That's what he's telling us about in Psalm 23. He's testifying, saying God will be there. God will protect you in times of fear. And you know, sometimes those are going to be those sorts of guardian angel moments, right? Where something happens, some accident, some danger, and you come through unscathed. I mean, I really marvel at those sorts of moments, and you've probably had that happen to you before. I mean, it's the kind of thing where you go afterwards and you're kind of thinking it through, and you say, God must have some purpose for me yet, right? Because it's one of those moments where you think, like, if the car would have just crossed a second earlier or a second later, I would have been toast. And honestly, I kind of think about that, like growing up on the farm, we were buzzing around on four-wheelers and whatnot. I'm sort of amazed that I survived childhood with all of my limbs and both eyes intact. And we've experienced close calls as adults too, right? Those moments you're like, whoa. And there's a mystery to this. Because we also know that there are moments when terrible, unhinging events unfold that are pretty much impossible to make sense of. The moments where the car accident that happens to God's servant and the people do not walk away from it. The cancer that strikes someone down in the prime of their life when it seems like they're just beginning to make a big impact for the kingdom. I mean, those are moments when the promise of Psalm 23 can ring a little hollow. Those are moments that can really shake you. And you can wonder, God, where are you in all of this? It can sometimes feel more like Psalm 8 than Psalm 23. Lord, what are human beings that you are mindful of them? And usually when our lives unravel like that, it's better to say less than more. I think that's the lesson of the book of Job in the Old Testament, that we don't have all the information to be able to understand why bad things happen to good people. We just have to sit with that mystery sometimes rather than try to explain it. But you know, as I've gotten older, the longer that I have walked with the Good Shepherd, what I've discovered is that even in those places where God doesn't protect us in a straightforward way, He is still with us. God is with us. And I always thought that was kind of like saying, or kind of like giving a consolation prize, right? Like, well, yeah, you still had to go through this terrible time. You still lost a loved one, but God is with you. I always saw that as like a consolation prize. Like, well, God didn't answer your prayer, but at least He's with you. But I don't know, I've come to appreciate more and more what that really means, because I think I've experienced that reality more deeply in my life as I've gotten older. God with us. And it's kind of hard to explain why that matters, but we experience hard things differently if we sense that God is walking with us through them. God is with us in those darkest valleys. We can't always understand what that means, but God is with us in those places of fear. God lays a table for us in the presence of our enemies. And what all that means is that come what may, beginning to end, we can trust God in the dash. That God promises that whatever happens in life, whether life or death, there's nothing that can separate us from his love. And that has become a reality for me, something that I've really cherished and grown into as I've walked more deeply into my faith. And this is what David's getting at in Psalm 23. That's his word through and through. Trust that good shepherd. Go with him wherever he leads you, because he is never leading us into a place of dissolution, a place where nothing matters, a place where it just falls apart for no reason. God is always leading us, like David sings in this psalm, to his eternal home, saying, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That's the period at the end of this psalm full of promises. Thanks be to God.